Well, John Michael, thank you so much for joining us in our conversation for our next episode of Expert Opinion. Super glad that you're here.
Of course.
In some ways, I felt like I've known you for a while because I've heard your name, but it's our first time actually meeting and actually having a conversation. So thanks for showing up today and being a part of our conversation.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate the invitation.
Sure, and I think your work that you're doing with Ceasefire PA, something that I don't really know a ton about, but my sense is that our values probably are pretty similar to our church, to me, and to your work. And so,
Definitely.
I would love for you just to introduce yourself for those who don't know you, and maybe just to begin talking about the work that you're doing in your organization.
Okay. So my name is John Michael Cottagnola Pickens. I am the campaign organizer, the Central Pennsylvania campaign organizer, or as I tell people, community organizer, because sometimes campaign organizer, that sounds really ominous.
Sure.
So community organizer with Ceasefire Pennsylvania, which is the state's largest gun violence prevention organization.
Okay.
And so I am the first person that Ceasefire has ever hired in this area to do this work. And so basically my work as a coalition or as a community organizer is to build coalitions across aisles politically, people of all backgrounds, whether you're rich, poor, white, black, brown, and to really build a cohesive movement around gun violence prevention and really to try to press our legislators to pass legislation that will make all Pennsylvanians safer, not just certain populations, which, that's certainly something we can talk about, is how gun violence predominantly impacts black and brown communities, whereas predominant white communities tend to be safer. And so we want legislation that can make black and brown communities safer as well.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely have to name that. How did you get involved? Like, what led you to this particular role, or that you would be passionate enough to want to be engaged in the public square and political square around this?
Right. So, yeah, when I was in college, I never saw myself wanting to get involved with the political sphere. But I minored in peace and conflict studies and really at Messiah College and really got engaged in justice work. And after college, I did a year of service with Brethren Volunteer Service, and I was a peace educator with Brethren Volunteer Service. And just talked to several groups about what it means to be a peacemaker and saw that as my calling to be a peacemaker. Whether that's talking about gun violence, whether that's talking about mass incarceration, whether that's talking about poverty, which is also an issue of violence. And so that eventually led me to seminary and went to Lancaster Theological Seminary, and I got MDiv degree, but I knew that I didn't want to be a pastor. I knew I wanted to do some sort of ministry.
Sure. That's good to know that about yourself.
Exactly. But I appreciate that the MDiv degree is a well-rounded degree, and then Lancaster was really challenging us to be in close proximity to where people are in pain. And to be that's where Jesus is, that Jesus and God has a special preference for the marginalized and for people who are in pain. And so I felt that calling to gun violence prevention work and justice work, through my faith. My faith is what calls me to this work. It's love your neighbor as yourself, right? It's the passage in Isaiah where it says that swords will be turned into plowshares. So it's that idea that let's put down our guns and let's make our community safer rather than more dangerous. So that has what has led me to this work. So.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know that you had an MDiv.
Yes.
There's been a few people on Expert Opinion this season that have had some MDivs who are serving outside of the traditional roles, which I think is actually really inspiring. And so I actually want to ask you maybe a philosophical question or theological question around peace.
Yes.
So for you, you have this bent towards peace, right?
Yes.
How do you define peace for you? For instance, we could talk about peace as this feeling, right? And there are biblical images, or Jesus talked about like the peace that surpasses all understanding, or the advocate that will come and bring peace, right? For you, how do you define peace? That's probably more than just a feeling or like the 1960s peace that we can often see. So for you, John Michael, what is peace?
So if I can, peace in one word, and I'll elaborate, of course, but peace in one word is shalom. So shalom is this idea that it's this holistic peace. So it's this idea that the earth is well, that climate change is, defeated, that we have an environment that is healthy, that we have, that poverty is defeated, that gun violence is, completely obliterated. So that for me is what peace is that this idea that, I think it's in Isaiah, right? The passage where the lion will lie down with the lamb.
That's right.
The child will lead them. Jesus talks about, in the Gospel of Luke, right, we have this idea of salvation as healing.
That's right.
But the healing is not just a physical healing. It's people who are broken physically are restored back to their communities on a social level as well. And so for me, that is also peace. That is a sense of shalom, because they are restored holistically. And so for me, that's what peace is. And that very much influences my work in gun violence prevention, because to talk about gun violence prevention is more than just talking about policy work. It's talking about public health. And how can we stop gun violence by holistically promoting affordable housing or jobs or access to food, things like that. So that's what peace is for me.
So I just really appreciate this definition of peace as shalom and of healing and having all things be right, and in the midst of the broken, kind of the mending of people, of communities, of our society, of our world, right? Of different levels, housing, climate change, and even gun violence. So thank you for just naming that.
Sure.
So even our conversation today is around peace and around shalom. And
Definitely.
so then that leads to gun violence. So now I would love, how do you define gun violence? And particularly, what is the heart and the mission behind what you're doing, even with ceasefire, with gun violence in particular?
Sure. So, the definition of gun violence, we have about 1,600 people that die on a yearly basis in Pennsylvania. Most people die from suicide. And then the second category is homicides. And then we have what's called unintentional shootings, which is when someone like a child gets access to a gun and shoots a sibling or a parent or themselves. So that's how we define gun violence. But right behind those numbers are people, right? And so we as an organization, a ceasefire, try to remember and remind people that, yes, there are these statistics, but behind those statistics and those numbers are people's lives and our names. And so that's gun violence, right? Is that dramatic impact on our state and on our country. Our country, it's close to 40,000 people that lose their lives to gun violence on a yearly basis. And that just continues to go up. And then to answer your question around ceasefire and our goal, our mission, simply put, our mission is to decrease the effect of gun violence on the state and to make Pennsylvania a safer state for all people. In an ideal world, we would love for gun violence to be completely gotten rid of, but we know that unfortunately that's not going to happen. So we want to decrease the number of suicides. We want to decrease the homicides. We want to decrease the number of unintentional shootings. We are a policy-driven organization. So we really focus on speaking truth to power with our legislators. But a lot of my work is trying to build coalitions in central Pennsylvania to then speak truth to power. So
What you mean by that is really just kind of are you trying to organize people and kind of gathering people? Right?
yes,
And trying to,
definitely.
yeah. And so speak a little bit more about that, what that coalition means for you, if that's the heart of your work. Bringing people together, organizations, victims, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, so it's bringing all kinds of people. So it's bringing faith leaders like yourself, Christian, Muslim, Jewish faith leaders, Buddhist, I mean, whoever.
Right, yep, interfaith.
Interfaith, very much. And it's also survivors, so people who have been harmed by gun violence themselves or family members who have lost a loved one. We have a space on our website where we interview survivors and we lift up their stories. But then it's also hunters, it's gun owners. So we as an organization say that we are not anti-gun.
Okay.
We are anti-gun violence. So we very much support responsible gun ownership.
Okay.
But what's happening is that responsible gun ownership is not not happening.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's what my work is as coalition building, is really trying to get all these people together to then speak to our legislators to try and pass legislation that will make Pennsylvania safer when it comes to gun violence.
I appreciate that distinction, that you're not anti-gun, you're anti-gun violence and responsible gun ownership, right?
Correct.
Which I think is probably in our quick media blip culture, that distinction probably isn't always heard, right?
Right.
Or we don't really listen to understand, we just kind of jump to respond, right?
Right.
And so it is impact because our city, as we talked about before, experiences gun violence, right?
Right.
Experiencing violence, right?
Definitely.
And again, these aren't statistics, these are families, right?
Definitely.
We probably both know of specific people, names
Right.
of kids,
Right.
of teenagers,
Right.
adults who are being victim
Right.
to gun violence. And
Right.
so tell me a little bit more like the gap that ceasefire or that you're trying to fill even in our own city, and maybe even a step back is just what causes gun violence, or what causes violence in a place like even like Harrisburg, but other urban or rural areas in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, this is a great week for you to ask me that because I'm taking a course with these two groups called Community Justice Action Fund and Cities United, which are Black-led organizations that focus a lot on gun violence. And they're talking about what are the root causes of gun violence. And they approach gun violence from a public health perspective, meaning, like, let's look at what is making like a young black kid pick up a gun. So personally for me, I look at the neighborhood I live in Allison Hill. There's not much affordable housing. There's not many job opportunities. There's not many after-school programs. So then you think about, there's frustration, there's anger over that. And one panelist I heard in this class I'm taking this week talked about particularly black young men in cities he was from Chicago, and he talked about being in survival mode all the time. And so the coping mechanisms he talked about for young black men in Chicago and other cities, and probably here in Harrisburg, particularly in Allison Hill, are guns or drugs. And so until the city starts investing in more affordable housing, employment, I think affordable food. I mean, until Dairy Family opened up, there wasn't really a supermarket in Allison Hill. You had to take a bus to Giant.
Right.
And then Dairy Family opened up, which, I mean, is wonderful. I think that's what really is at the root of gun violence is poverty, is this frustration over communities of color consistently being disinvested in. Is there gun violence in the suburbs? Yes. But the rates don't seem to be, well, it's not as much of it. Homicides are much lower
Yeah.
in the suburbs as they are in cities.
And you mentioned at the very beginning that particularly communities of color have a higher rate of gun violence than
They do.
that of white, right?
Correct.
And there's an economic aspect to that.
Definitely.
It's also an urban, suburban, urban and rural, right?
Correct.
But we know that like gun violence happens in all communities. Statistically, though, it's just higher in particular communities of color. So, and I've even heard in a conversation recently that because of even COVID, so for instance, our own city, school is 100% online. Sports have been canceled, right?
Correct.
And so we've seen some violence among teenagers,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so wanting to know like some effects around that. So like kids are not at school.
Right.
They're not in sports in particular, right? Like
Right.
high schoolers, right?
Right.
And so what does that lead them to do, right? And like
Right.
you said, drugs or gun violence, right?
Right.
And so, which is interesting, even just as community members, community leaders, right? There's a gap there.
Right.
And what do you sense of that gap? Or even when you personally sense of that gap, just as like, what does that lead you to do? Or how does it make you lament? Or what do you like?
Yeah. I mean, so that makes me want to. So right now, our city is in the process of talking about our budget, and so this is a really relevant conversation because our mayor is wanting to give, I think it's close to $3 million more towards the police. Now, it's for what he's calling civilian positions, but it's still money that's going towards the police department rather than into the community. And so like what I just talked about, that money, if it was invested in Allison Hill or in other communities, uptown,
Right.
or just in the city in general.
That's right. Comprehensive.
Right,
Yeah.
right. That could, $3 million, I mean, that could do a lot. So I find myself as a citizen of Harrisburg wanting to get involved in that process of giving feedback on the budget, which is, I feel like, getting involved in the weeds
That's right.
of our community, which I hadn't been interested in previous years. But I'm more aware of that, and so it's, making me much more of an active citizen, realizing that all of this is connected. The increase of gun violence is connected to the decrease in funding in our communities and the increase in funding in policing.
But I think this is so relevant actually because some of the policies that you're talking about, like I would love to know just as like what are some of the specific policies you're working on? And you name a couple like background checks and extreme risk protection orders and loss and slow reporting. Tell me a little bit more around what Ceasefire is seeking to do
Sure.
in your kind of reducing of gun violence.
Sure. Yeah, so those three policies that you mentioned are what we are calling our common agenda.
Okay.
And so those are the three policies that we are really pushing in this legislative year, so 2021, and probably beyond, we'll see. But background checks, I mean, that's the idea that someone who has a criminal history or has a record of mental illness would then not be allowed to purchase a gun. So then there would be a more comprehensive background check than was currently available that would then prevent them from purchasing a gun. And there is, nationwide, there is a lot of support for this from gun owners and non-gun owners alike. I think it's around, Johns Hopkins surveyed people, and I think it's like 88%
Really?
in support of background checks. The extreme risk protection orders, or IRRPO for short, that is when a family member or an intimate partner or someone that has lived with someone sees an individual acting in a way that they're going to harm themselves or harm someone else. That could be like they're saying, I'm going to kill you, or they are threatening an animal, or they're showing harm to an animal when they previously haven't.
Yeah.
That family member can then issue or ask a judge to issue an emergency order. And after, I believe it's 72 hours, that person will then have a court case
Okay.
with a lawyer, with the witness,
Mm-hmm.
and the judge will hear, well, why have you asked me to issue this IRRPO?
Huh.
And if the judge determines, okay, you are at a risk to yourself or others, then the firearms need to be removed for at least a year.
Wow.
It can be less than a year if the person then applies to a judge, and the judge then needs to see evidence, though, that you've gotten better.
That's great.
And then the witness who then initially petitioned the judge for the IRRPO after a year can petition again, but they have to go through that process all over again.
Okay.
So an IRRPO only lasts for a year.
Okay.
And so these were first instituted in Connecticut in 1999,
Really?
and they were found to be really effective with suicides in particular and mass shootings.
Sure.
But about 13.7% decline in suicide rate.
Wow.
And so there has been bipartisan support for this. It's something that Lindsey Graham was in support of on a federal level.
Wow.
A Republican actually introduced it here in Pennsylvania. It has not passed, but it has at least been introduced.
Okay.
So that's an IRRPO.
Yeah.
And then the last one is lost and stolen guns. And so currently here in Pennsylvania, gun owners are not required to report that their gun has been lost or stolen. So then what happens is that someone could lose their gun or it could be stolen, and then those guns can be used in a crime. And then the police officer will track that gun back to this gun owner and say, well, why didn't you report this gun lost or stolen? And their excuse can be, well, I didn't realize it was lost or had been stolen.
Sure.
And that's currently that's legitimate. Like, again, you don't have to report that.
Wow.
And so what we're advocating for and what we hope is that if a gun owner was required to report it lost or stolen, is that then that would cut down on the number of guns that are out on the streets that are used in homicides. Or even straw purchasing.
Yeah, that's right.
So straw purchasing, I guess I should probably define that.
Sure, please.
Straw purchasing is where someone who is legally allowed to purchase a gun goes into a gun shop and then purchases a gun for someone who is not legally allowed to have a gun.
Wow.
So it'd be like me maybe going in and buying a gun.
Mm.
Let's say if you're not legally
That's right.
able to have a gun, I could then give it to you
Mm-hmm.
after we leave the gun shop.
Yeah.
And so and then the straw purchaser, of course, then can give the excuse to the police officer, oh, well, the gun was lost or stolen. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Whereas, of course, they actually gave it to that person.
Yeah.
So lost or stolen would then require the straw purchaser to report that the gun was not in their possession.
Yeah.
So that is lost or stolen.
Yeah. What I appreciate in all three of them, and is this where some of the language that happens in the national level, just like common sense kind of gun laws, right?
Correct.
So it's really in some sense, again, it goes back to your initial premise. Ceasefire is not necessarily anti-gun, right?
Correct.
Which is a whole different conversation, honestly. It has a lot more implications. Where this is just saying, sure, right? If you want to volunteer in a school, you have to have background checks. If someone wants to volunteer with the kids at my church, right? I have to have their background check, right? Because I want to make sure they're not a predator
Right.
or to cause harm to our kids. And so in
Right.
some sense, it's the same thing to say. To have something that could cause harm to people,
Right.
there needs to be background checks, right?
Correct.
And IRRPO, that if someone's going to hurt themselves or threatening, that we should hinder, right? And
Correct.
we have that with kids now. We have that with ourselves now.
Correct.
And so it's the same kind of thing. That's what I hear you saying. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Which I think is helpful, right? And so what has been the reaction to that? And how have people responded? And in this work so far?
So, since I am the first person hired in Central Pennsylvania, and I just started in September, it's very much, these past couple of months have very much just been introducing myself,
Okay.
But I will say that there is a lot of energy around gun violence prevention and common sense gun violence policies in central Pennsylvania, which of course we are seen as a more conservative part of the state. And we are, but at the same time, I mean, I'm getting a lot of energy from places like Franklin County, from Adams County. There are groups in those two counties that are very active around gun violence. And so I've been very surprised and impressed with the energy behind this.
Awesome.
So the response has been overall positive.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, what would you say to someone like who owns a gun? Honestly, to be completely honest, I don't own a gun.
Neither do I.
I don't have any guns in my house. So I'm asking this question. I'll put this out there. I'm owning, right, that I'm not necessarily a biased person in this conversation.
Right.
So maybe that's helpful, actually.
Right.
But as someone whom I have family members who own guns, right? Church members who own guns, right? My last church I served was in Franklin County, right?
Oh, okay.
I think they all had guns, right? And so, like, what would you say to someone, right, like who owns a gun, right, to be passionate around this work? Like, what's a little bit of the why, right? How would you want to? What would you want to say to someone who owns a gun right now in your work with Ceasefire?
Yeah, so a couple weeks ago, I actually had a conversation with a good friend of mine who is a gun owner, but agrees mostly with the work I'm doing. And so we just talked about what it means to be a good citizen. And so we need to have that conversation about what does it mean to be a good citizen of the state? Like, let's look at, do you really need more guns to be safer in this state? Let's look at that. And then I think we need to talk about, so I think part of it is talking about the unintentional shootings that happen. So I think gun locks, that's also, I think, an easy entry point into a conversation with a gun owner is that, I mean, how can you oppose gun storage?
That's right.
That's keeping your children safe. And so I think that's a good entry point. I mean, for me, it's about not just violence prevention, but it's also family safety. And so I think that is a way for me to enter into a conversation with someone that has a gun, is to talk about family safety. So it's to make it personal.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and to not then go down the slippery slope of, well, you're advocating for my guns to be taken away. No, I'm not. I'm advocating for your family and for other families to be safe.
Which I think is a helpful distinction. And I'm so glad you defined peace earlier as shalom. And it's ultimately, I think, what I hear you saying is, it's not about taking guns away, which often is what the narrative becomes.
Right.
But it's about, like, how can we keep all of us safe in a different way of thinking around this and having policies, right, state and national level, that would make sure that guns stay in the hands of people who should have guns and those whom shouldn't, right? Maybe shouldn't have them, or to make sure that they're safe for all of our families, right? And so the accidental, and even thinking about our own city, right? Just like how, for me, it was a different conversation in my rural town of Franklin County, right? Than here, right? When hearing about gun violence is a normal thing.
Right.
And even a couple of Sundays ago, I know even my friend Josiah, right? They were having church at First with their brother, and they heard gunfire, right? And even recently, just like a couple of blocks, like 2 blocks away, like 3 different, like in a week span, just like shootings right near our church, right? So for me, it's no longer this is distant, but it's like how can we keep our neighborhoods in a way that's safer, when harm is being done, not potentially, it is being done.
Definitely.
So Ceasefire, I think, what I'm appreciating is that some on-ramps, it's a level of just kind of running to bring together all kinds of people, the coalition, right? To have some conversation.
Very much.
If someone is listening right now and they're a little bit passionate, they're like, I want to learn more, like, what would you say are some helpful ways, even with you, like, helpful ways for people to be engaged in this work around policy and this coalition building?
So with me individually, I mean, I'm always open to having a conversation with someone or an organization so they can reach out to me personally.
Great.
I can give my email if that's helpful.
We can make sure it's in the description
Okay.
for people to know. Yeah.
Great. Ceasefire also does a lot of education, and so we do workshops
Okay.
that educate, again, all types of people. I have done a lot of workshops with people of faith.
Great.
I'm doing one tonight,
Oh.
but can also do workshops for people who aren't people of faith. So that's another way to get engaged. We are, since it's going to be a new legislative term starting in January, with the new people that were just elected, we are going to be doing some, I think, advocacy meetings, not meetings, well, yeah,
Sure.
meetings with legislators. And so we're going to be encouraging people to then join us to meet with their legislators to talk about gun violence and to pressure them. I mean, a simple way is to go to our website,
Good.
sign up,
Yep.
ceasefirepa.org.
That's awesome.
So those are some ways to get engaged.
That's awesome. I have a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
And so let me first ask, so I think that's helpful. So people should be engaged and should engage in conversation with their legislators. But I think part of that is for us in that work is to work through some stereotypes that we might have or some stigmas that we have around this conversation. And what would you say, I think a part of this work that we can engage is to reconcile with some of those stereotypes. And what are some of the stereotypes that you've had in conversation around gun violence or gun legislation or gun control? And maybe we've touched on some of them, but just want to, I think part of it is that deconstructing some of our thinking, even as people of faith.
Yeah, so I think a major stereotype or a misconception is that we are safer with more guns, that more guns equals a safer community. When again, part of my job is to do research and to look at statistics, and the research just shows that that's not true, that the communities that are actually safer and the states that are actually safer are the ones that have fewer guns.
Huh.
So that is a misconception that I think just needs to be completely broken down, is that, yeah, more guns does not equal us being safer.
That's good.
And then I think the other misconception is this idea of black on black crime.
Uh-huh. That's right.
This idea that, well, black people are inherently more violent than white people. And so that goes, which is just, again, statistically, is just not true.
That's right.
We don't talk about white on white crime where the statistics are almost equal.
Yeah. So you can say that. I almost need you to say that again as a white male, because you can talk about that in a way that people of color cannot.
Right.
Right.
And I will say that again.
Yeah.
That black on black crime is a myth.
Yeah.
That white on white crime is just as high. I shouldn't say as high, is just about, is comparable. The statistics are comparable to black on black crime. So that is a misnomer.
Yeah. Which is so helpful because even part of what I want to talk about was Black Lives Matter, right?
Right.
George Floyd, Ahmaud
Right.
Arbery, Breonna Taylor, right? So many names, and even recent. I think Goodson, I think is Colson something. His last name, who just was murdered recently, the last couple of days, right?
Yes.
By the time we were recording this, right? And I wish I had his name written down because I was just thinking about that this morning. One of the biggest reactions was in those moments, thinking about police brutality, which is a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
But similar is the response, well, urban crime or black on black crime, right? As a reason to say that, well, these communities are just more unsafe, right?
Right.
Because black people are more violent, right?
Right.
And that's not what you're saying.
No, it's not what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that then distracts us from looking at the root causes of the crime in those communities. Like, why are people of color killing each other? We don't look at those root causes. So again, going back to the public health perspective, it's looking at the level of unemployment in different communities. It's looking at the rates of affordable housing. It's looking at, well, how accessible is healthy food?
Or transportation issues.
Exactly, or transportation issues. But yet, as a country, we don't look at that deeper narrative. It's the simple narrative to say, oh, well, black people are more violent.
That's right.
Rather than looking at, well, no, it's not that simple. they're coming from communities that are disinvested in.
That's right. That's right. And they're raised in it. It's
Correct.
not like they're moving to them, right?
Right.
Like, I often hear it's like, well, they're moving there. It's like, no, like these are communities where they're born and raised,
Right.
generationally in some sense.
Right.
And they're raised, and kids are having less opportunities, right?
Right.
Like you named, right? Like early in a previous conversation, right? That we were having just now, right? Like less, after school programs, or
Right.
less, less extracurriculars to help kind of broaden their experience of life, to give them alternatives to violence and drugs, right?
Right.
Wow. So how else would you say you or Ceasefire is standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and maybe even LGBTQ inclusion, but particularly around Black Lives Matter, which has been a topic of conversation the last year?
Definitely. So I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that goes back to what I talked about with wanting to make sure that funding goes back into communities and not necessarily police departments seeing a dramatic increase in funding. And so we need to see that communities more invested in. And I know I've been saying that a lot, but I want to hit on that a lot. And I think that's part of Ceasefire kind of being in proximity with people who are the most impacted. I think part of that work is also lifting up the voices of survivors. And so we say that we are led by people who have been impacted by gun violence. And so part of my work is to interview survivors if they're at a place, of course, to share their story. And to then let that drive our work. And then the LGBTQ, I think that goes back into what I just mentioned, is to make sure that we are in proximity with groups of people that are impacted by gun violence, whether that is people of color, LGBTQ communities, dairy farmers. There's another thing. In Lancaster County, I found out that dairy farmers there's an increasing rate of suicides among dairy farmers.
Really?
And so,
What's
again,
the cause of that?
the cause of that is milk prices are dropping.
Of course, right. That's right.
And so then they're losing their
It's
source of it.
economic. Yeah.
Exactly. They're losing their source of income. So then that's something they've done all their lives, or most of their lives. So then they feel desperate. So then they end their lives.
Wow.
Sorry, that's not your initial question, but
No,
I think
But I appreciate the nuance, though, to say that, because I can get critiqued, because I'm sometimes critiqued on saying things like Black Lives Matter. As a faith leader, sometimes, if someone doesn't agree. So, or talking about
I would
LGBT
be right
inclusion.
there with you.
But what I appreciate, though, is the nuance to say, in this conversation around gun violence, there is a level of us that need to stand up against and for Black lives, right? That Black lives matter,
Definitely.
have worth,
Definitely.
should be allowed to be alive, to
Definitely.
have life, right? So
Yes.
and even thinking about LGBTQ, particularly trans women, right?
Yes.
And in particular, transgender women of color.
Correct.
Right? Particularly in urban spots, right? That's to value their life, right?
Definitely.
Is a part of this conversation. It has to be,
Definitely.
right?
Definitely.
But for you to make the next transition to say, dairy farmers in Lancaster County, for me to say this is not necessarily a political issue for one particular side of the aisle, but to say this is actually a life issue. People in my church probably get tired of me talking about, like, I firmly believe in the passage of John 10:10, right? When Jesus is going on about the great shepherd, it says, I have come, like the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, right? I've come to give life abundantly. And I think Jesus on the side of life, right? And this is a holistic thing, that if part of your work, Ceasefire, is to help step in the gap for anyone who wants to not have life or wants to harm someone else, this is essential gospel work.
Definitely.
That's what I hear you saying, right?
Yes, definitely. This is gospel work. And I think it is important for me to say that Black lives do matter as a white male. That is important for me to say. And that
That's right.
particularly trans women of color, their
right.
lives do matter.
That's
And
right.
so I think that is important for me to say that on camera.
Thank you for saying
But yes, I appreciate you pointing out that nuance, is that it is going back to what you said about John 10:10. It is Jesus wanting to bring abundant life
That's right.
for people who have been marginalized.
That's right.
Because I do believe that God has a special preference for that's, I think, the liberation theology coming out of me.
Yeah, I love it.
But it is, I mean, the nuance of me bringing up the dairy farmers is that, yes, that they should have abundant life as well.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, all people, like this belovedness of people. I mean, that's my orientation, that all people are children of God, right?
definitely.
And have inherent worth. And so, anything else you want to share before I ask my final question around you and your passion and your work with Ceasefire?
I don't think so. I think just that, yeah, I realize that I am new to this work here in central Pennsylvania, and so it's going to take time to build relationships, and I value that. And so I've had conversations with people where the initial conversation is just kind of getting to know them, and so I can't get my ask in, but that's completely understandable. I've lived in Harrisburg for close to 10 years, and I've seen people, change makers, come and go. And so I realize that there's a lot of cynicism in this city about people who want to change the systems. So they come in, they say they want to change gun violence, or they want to make Harrisburg a better city, and then they leave. And so I'm here to stay, and I want to develop relationships with people with my work. So I think I'll just say that.
So let me ask this final question.
Sure.
And if someone gets to this point in this particular conversation, I'm impressed, right? Particularly because I'm going to encourage anyone who maybe owns a gun, overly passionate around this, people who are infuriated right now, I actually want them to reach out to you, right?
Yes.
Because I think part of this work is, and I've been so convinced by this, is like we don't have conversation around this. We'll yell at one another via social media, or we'll talk in such a way that we're seeking to speak instead of listen. So I first want to name that before we end this episode today. I just think if anyone is passionate, gun owner, infuriated, or has experience, is a victim of it, to be a part of this coalition, because the work that you're doing to build shalom and safety in communities, I think, is so essential, and maybe one of the significant things we have to work at as in our nation right now, because I think one life is too many.
Right.
And I'm always inspired, and I'll get to the final question in a moment, but I'm always inspired by, even like after the Parkland high school shooting, right? Some of the strong advocates for gun violence, or for common sense laws around guns are some of those high school students, and they inspire me as people who, like, I've not been victim to gun violence, right? And so what my opinion isn't as important, at least this isn't coming from me, like isn't as important as someone who's been a victim to it. Their voice matters.
Right.
So if anyone, I just want to encourage them, because I've appreciated our conversation and your openness to this work. So here's my final question. If someone's got to this part and they're like, I will never be involved in this, right? They're like, okay, this is great, John and Michael. So glad it's your work, not my work, right? Or people who are like, I'm not really sure, I have much of an opinion, so they don't really know how to navigate this, or they're just like, I'm not going to do this. But I want to ask you a bigger question, though. Like, in light of this or not, what's one thing that you really hope a mind shift change? Or what's your one desire for humanity in the midst of this time, in the midst of all that's going on right now in our world? We're in the midst of just the deep work that you're doing and your learning and your like coalition and your advocacy. What's just like one thing, at the very least, if they're never going to show up at anything ceasefire, one heart or one mind shift change that you pray for humanity and for maybe our city?
So I think, and this may sound so simple, but yeah, it's not, is that I want people to be able to listen to each other and to be able to talk to each other. So, and that for me personally means I ride my bike somewhat regularly, especially on the weekends. And I ride by the Capitol. And there have been a lot of protests recently, and there have been people, well, guys particularly, who have bulletproof vests, and they have military-style weapons. And I would love it for me to be able to go up and have a civil conversation with someone like that. And to talk about, let's talk about our differences without turning into a shouting match. But I don't know if it would. And so I feel like being able to build relationships across those differences, being able to have those conversations, but going deeper, being able to then challenge each other. Because it's not just about having those surface level conversations. We can't stop there. We do need to be able to challenge each other. And I think going to that, I really hope and pray that, I pray that we may realize as a state and even as a country and as a people that might does not equal right. And so going back to that idea that more guns does not make us safe. And so that is my prayer, that we may realize that. And so again, as a ceasefire employee, we are not anti-gun, we are anti-gun violence. And the statistics show that more guns increases gun violence. And so I think I gave you two, but those are two hopes
So good.
and two dreams, that we can build relationships across divides, and those relationships can lead to each other challenging one another. And then also the dream that we can reduce gun violence by having fewer guns. So,
Thank you for both of those,
sure.
and for inviting us into a posture of listening, of deep kind of dialogue around this, and to a place of working towards the shalom, working towards peace. I'm inspired by that today, and I feel in some way inspired to seek that in my own life, and to seek that in even how we as a church think about each other and our community and in the world. So thank you, John Michael, for speaking into our church, into our community today. Thanks for your work.
Chris. I appreciate you engaging the community in these conversations. So thank you.
Of course, it's an honor. Thank you.